Hello and welcome to Chain Reaction, a podcast series examining America's role in the world. I am your host, Aaron Stein, the Director of Research at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia. Every 2 weeks, we will talk to experts about a variety of topics and why they matter for U.S. foreign policy. Hello and welcome. We're talking again with Rob Lee, who's an FPRI Senior Fellow, about the latest in Ukraine. I think, Rob, it's been about a week since the start of Russian combat operations. The general consensus, both in the media and amongst the expert community, is that the Russian invasion has not gone as planned, amidst widespread reports of logistical failures, perhaps extending down to mid-level officers and Russian officers themselves, and even troops not really understanding that they were about to launch a large-scale invasion and thinking that they were actually going to be involved in exercises in Belarus. We've also seen, obviously, the Ukrainian side put up far stiffer resistance than I think the Russians anticipated, and certainly differing with some of the more pessimistic assessments that we saw leaked to the U.S. press beforehand, perhaps that matched the Russian enthusiasm for a quick war. With all that's I just said, perhaps you give us a sense of what's going on in the conflict and where we're at about 6 days in.
Sure. I think, we're about 7 days now, I think. But a few hours, be 7 days in. So I think there's some disagreements about how well this is going for Russia, right? Where some people are saying this is not going well. There are all these these problems that are occurring. And then other people are saying, well, the rate of advance has actually been pretty good when you look at historical campaigns and the U.S. campaign in Iraq. That it's always that Russian forces have moved pretty deep into Ukraine, given the distances we're talking about, and that it's not a complete failure. I'm somewhere between those, where we talk about what Russia's done so far. The rate of advance has been not at a pretty decent rate, especially in the south. Right, they have moved pretty far inland. Of course, the rate of advance doesn't mean they control these areas, right? They've moved farther in, doesn't mean they actually control all the areas they've driven past, or that the supply lines are that secure. The initial goal of the campaign, they had this kind of optimistic option, basically, which is try to get to Kyiv as fast as possible. Clearly, try to get to Zelensky, try to get him to surrender, and try to get him surrender the country, and basically achieve a fait accompli, right? And they try to do it with light forces, and that's what we saw that air assault helicopter operation at Hostomel, northwest of Kyiv. Clearly, they're trying to get there as quick as possible. And I think in some ways they're trying to achieve what they did in Crimea, right? Where they drove into the Crimea. If you move fast enough before people, if they're not expecting it, you achieve surprise that you can right away, basically achieve a fait accompli, and that's it right there. I think they're trying to do that in Kyiv, and clearly it didn't work, right? Clearly, the warning signs had been there for a while. Clearly, the Ukrainians, even though maybe they didn't raise the alarm until the very end, they clearly knew this invasion was about to happen. So that option didn't work. And when you look at kind of Russia's overall concept of operations, it seems pretty clear at the political level they decided they didn't want to inflict too many casualties on the Ukrainian military or Ukrainian civilians. All right, so it's pretty clear they deliberately tried to not maximally employ the Russian Air Force, Russian fires, cruise missile strikes, so on. They did some of those strikes the first night. They obviously tried to take out some key kind of command and control nodes, some key airfields or air defense systems. But clearly they were holding back, right? And especially when you look at Russian operations elsewhere, it's pretty clear that they were holding back. And it was a bit perplexing initially. My view is that they were hoping if they could execute that optimistic option, that the fewer Ukrainians they kill, the fewer the less destruction that they inflict on Ukraine, the better, basically. That would be the easiest way to achieve a long-term political solution by removing Zelensky from power, some kind of regime change, and hopefully getting Ukrainians to be content, or at least not resist that kind of change. Well, that clearly failed, right? And it's pretty obvious after basically 2 days, it was pretty obvious that optimistic view is not going to happen. And what's surprising since then is that most surprising of the overall campaign is that they could have tried to kind of go for a death stroke at the Ukrainian military right away, to try and knock them out, to try and significantly degrade their capabilities, knock out command and control, knock out the Air Force, knock out the air defenses, all those kind of capabilities. And they failed to do that. And they still have failed to do that, right? The Ukrainian military, the Ukrainian Air Force is still flying aircraft, right? They're still flying Su-24s and Su-25s. They still have TB2s that are operating. Zelensky is still he still has command and control of the Ukrainian armed forces, right? I think Ukrainian armed forces are still being able to communicate with each other, so that their command and control and communications hasn't been blocked. Ukrainian air defense systems are still there, right? So Russian aviation is working. It's being used more heavily now, but most of those sorties, right? It's operations near Russian territory, right? So near Kharkiv, which is near the Russian border, or in southern Ukraine. But they're not really pushing deep into Ukraine, right? I don't think we've seen any significant air operations over Kyiv or most of the areas. It still seems as though Ukrainian air defense systems are still a potent enough threat preventing the Russian Air Force from really operating across Ukraine with any kind of superiority or supremacy. So it's dramatic that has not happened yet. So all those things together, those kind of failures, that has allowed Ukraine has had a number of tactical victories, and a lot of those kind of victories were able to boost morale, boost a sense of momentum in Ukraine. It's probably led more people to resist, right? I think Russia hoped that they moved in fast enough that too many Ukrainians would not have the situation awareness, know what was going on, wouldn't have time to bring up arms and kind of resist in an armed way against the invasion. Well, at this point, right, they took too much time. They didn't knock out those capabilities, didn't degrade Ukrainian military capabilities sufficiently, and so it's given Ukrainians, including Ukrainian civilians, the hope that they can defend against this Russian invasion. And that was a huge blunder by the Russians in that regard. So those issues are still that's still a huge problem for Russia. And now the optimistic kind of view that if they get to Zelensky and he could quickly surrender the country, maybe that made some sense, right? I think it was way overly optimistic of what was actually possible. But now all the other plans, right, Plan B or Plan C, all those involve using quite a bit of force from the Russian military. And the question is it realistic at all at this point that Russia can achieve some kind of significant long-term change of Ukraine's political orientation, whether it's regime change or something else, a long-term kind of sustainable solution? Can they achieve that and translate military force into that? And it's not clear to me they can, right? And it seems as though they've bitten off more than they could chew. And every day this war goes on, Ukrainians get more angry about this, right? And one of the really notable things is that Russia has had quite a success in the south, right? They've moved, they've taken a number of cities in the south, and they continue to kind of progress pretty far. But even in a lot of these cities, right, these Russian-speaking cities, the cities where they might have expected they'd get more support from the local populace, there's already some very visible pushback. And there's a lot of people. There have been protests in a lot of these cities. It's very clear that a lot of these Ukrainian citizens do not want Russian forces there. They do not want to become part of Russia, and they're not happy about this. And if that's happening in these Russian-speaking areas, the areas closer to Russia, closer to Crimea or the Donbass, you can imagine the other parts of Ukraine are going to be even more hostile to that. And so basically, the question is, it's hard to understand how this is going to work out well for Russia, because right now Kharkiv is holding out, Kyiv is holding out. There will likely be a significant fight for Odessa, but it's not very obvious how Russia will take those cities, right? So Kharkiv right now, Russian forces moved in there a few days ago. They initially moved in with a very light force with Spetsnaz. It was a bit bizarre because they went in with a few lightly armored Tiger vehicles. They went in kind of patrolling. They hit some dismounts. Very small force, without armor, without BMPs, without tanks, and they were immediately repelled, right? And obviously, in urban environments, it's very hard to fight. And if you don't bring up all those kind of additional capabilities, it's even more difficult. So that force got repelled. They lost a bunch of vehicles. They had some POWs taken. Just kind of a really bizarre kind of a tactical failure for them. Ever since then, they've been hitting Kharkiv pretty heavily with cruise missiles, with MLRS strikes, with cluster munitions, a variety of kind of things. And Kharkiv is holding out, right? They're not surrendering, and it looks as though what Russia's trying to do is they're trying to kind of coerce the population. And it looks like this is a signal for Kyiv too, that they're trying to coerce the population by continuing to conduct strikes in Kharkiv, and basically trying to convince civilians to leave, to flee, and then they'll maybe try and take it just with the military, right? And ideally, maybe with fewer civilian casualties at that point. But ultimately, doing these kind of coercive things, it's not clear that people in Kharkiv are giving up, right? It doesn't seem as though it's breaking the resistance. And then it appears they're going to try and do the same thing with Kyiv. And all the questions remain, right? If you try to take Kyiv and the Ukrainians resist block by block, as it appears, that they are willing to do, the only way you can take a city like that is basically by destroying much of the city, right? And we've seen this before. It happened obviously in Grozny and Aleppo, and then again with the U.S. and Fallujah, right? Even a military that tries its best, if you are trying to take an urban environment from a committed enemy or adversary, it's very difficult to take that kind of city without destroying much of the city, right? And one thing we know is that the U.S. military has far more precision-guided munitions than the Russian military, far more accurate precision-guided munitions than the Russian military, and low collateral damage munitions, which the Russians lack as well. So all those things say that basically it would be very difficult for Russia to fight in cities without, unleashing, a lot of damage on a city and killing inhabitants. If there are a lot of civilians there, it would be a lot of civilian casualties. So all those things are significant risks. So, we would look at the next few weeks of this campaign, and at this point, it looks so we're probably looking at a few weeks to a month, right? And I think the timeline that makes sense now is that Russia's facing really significant sanctions right now. Far stronger than what I thought they were going to have, and also there's just been a remarkable change in private corporations and private enterprise in the West who are breaking ties with Russia. In some cases, I think too far, right? I mean, just there are things that are making it very life difficult for individual Russians, and I don't think that's helpful. But those changes, they're so dramatic that some of them are already having a really significant effect, right? Apple Pay is cut off, credit cards, all that kind of thing. Obviously, the ruble collapse. But also in about a month, we're going to see a lot more effects that are going to disrupt the way of life for Russians, right? So there are sanctions that are happening on commercial aviation. Those are going to go after spare parts. They're going to go after leasing, insurance, all that kind of stuff. Most commercial aircraft in Russia are either made by Boeing or Airbus. So they have Russian ones. They have the Sukhoi Superjet, which it doesn't have a great track record. But most of them are Boeing and Airbus. And basically, after about a month or so, they're going to run out of spare parts of those aircrafts, and they're not going to be able to replace them. They're not going to do a lot of maintenance on them. And ultimately, we're going to start seeing is in a few weeks, commercial aviation in Russia is going to start collapsing, and they're going to have to significantly reduce flights. Right. Not to mention they might, there's discussion about them, banning people from leaving Russia, all these other kind of things happening. It's really, kind of concerning moment. And I've already heard anecdotes of a number of Russians who are trying to leave now because they see a crackdown coming. Some of the independent media is already getting shut down, and the trajectory looks quite bleak at this point. So when you look at it as a domestic issue, right, in about a month, we're probably going to see some pretty significant economic disruptions to the way of life for Russians. And of course, at that point, Putin has done a lot to prepare basically the domestic environment to make it difficult to protest against him, right? Obviously, many of the Navalny people, the opposition, are either in exile or in prison. He's really been effective at repressing that. But it basically, the next few weeks, if the economic disruptions continue, which they will, and the casualties continue, right? There's every reason to believe that there's going to be some domestic problems for Putin. And it's to me, it's shocking that he kind of got himself in this position. And we look at the casualties figures so far. I think yesterday's when they announced casualty figures. Russia announced they had 500 killed in action and 1,500 wounded in action. That is believed to be low. I think U.S. officials said. I think NBC reported that they think that the killed in action figure is closer to 6,000. I would say it's probably very vague at this point, not very well known because it's hard to, even the Russian military probably doesn't know how many casualties they have because it's hard to tell during the war. Those are really significant numbers though. So under Putin, of the wars that he's fought, he's been broadly successful in those wars. In the Second Chechen War, Russia sustained a little over 3,000 killed in action, but that was over several years, right? And I think the most in 1 year was maybe 1,000 or less than 1,000. In Georgia, they sustained less than 100 casualties, fewer than 100 casualties. Fewer than 100 deaths. In Ukraine in 2014, 2015, I think it was about 200, 300. And then in Syria, it's only been the same thing for over the last 6 years, 7 years. It's only been a couple hundred most likely. And so even if the 500 figure is wrong, even if that was the right way we take that figure, that is dramatically more casualties and servicemen losses the Russian military has taken under Putin than in any previous war, right? So it's really significant. And when you look at the trajectory of this conflict, it's not over. And there's no reason to believe the number of casualties is going to decrease dramatically. Because as Russia continues moving into Ukraine, supply lines get longer. The Ukrainian resistance fighters, they can easily still they'll have more targets of opportunity as Russian forces move in deeper, because it will be more likely they'll find individual soldiers or individual vehicles that are by themselves that are vulnerable to being attacked. It's very clear that Russian forces were not prepared to deal with these kind of attacks on supply lines. They did not learn what the U.S. learned from in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they're making some, frankly, kind of bizarre mistakes. So all those things point they're going to keep taking casualties, and it's probably going to get worse and worse. And Ukrainians have done a just really surprisingly good job defending in a variety of places. And it's hard to know exactly what they've done. The Ukrainian military is very good operational security. It's not very obvious to me, at least from public sources, of where they're fighting. But we have some idea of what they're doing. And one is in the region to the northwest of Kyiv, in Hostomel, Bucha, or this area to the northwest. Russian forces have been there basically since the beginning of the conflict, where they made that air assault operation on the first day, and they've had a presence more or less since then. The Ukrainians are still inflicting a lot of casualties on Russian forces there, and this is mostly VDV airborne forces, right? So elite Russian forces, and consistently keep seeing videos of destroyed VDV columns in that area, right? So and the vehicles are very easy to identify. So the VDV is taking really heavy casualties there, and Ukrainians are managing to hold them off, and they held them off for a week now, and it appears that they might be able to hold them off for longer. There's a lot of talk about that large Russian convoy to the northwest of Kyiv. I don't know exactly what the status of that is. It appears Ukraine is still hitting that with aviation, with TB2s. It's still kind of throwing a wrench into the plans that Russia has. Either way, it's probably going to take a few weeks for them to surround Kyiv and to besiege it, right? And so I don't think Kyiv's going to fall, any time in the next week or two. It'll probably take longer than that. And so we start looking at a timeline here as casualties keep going up, right? And it looks like they're going to keep going quite significantly. As they go up, as economic disruptions occur, at what point does that reach a critical mass where Russians start saying enough is enough, a real outpouring of domestic anger about this? It's really hard to say. I have no idea. But I think it will happen at some point. And if the war is still going at that point, it's going to be increasingly difficult for Russia to continue, especially if at that stage we're seeing them, trying to level Kyiv, right? Just destroy buildings, inflicting casualties on civilians, anything along those lines. So there's a big question to me is if this conflict goes on more than a month, right? And again, it's really hard to predict this, but if the active phase goes on more than a month, at what point is the domestic threat to Putin going to be too much where he has to make some kind of compromise? I'm not sure. I don't think he has to do that right now. I don't think that the threat is immediate, but probably in a few weeks, it's going to present itself more and more, and that's going to be something Russian officials are going to have to consider. The question to me is, it's not clear what kind of compromise makes sense for Russia at this point. So clearly they went to Ukraine with very ambitious political goals. It was clearly designed to solve what they failed to solve in 2015, right? So the Minsk agreements were never implemented. That was done by force. So this time it was always clearly going to use more force to try and force some kind of political orientation change for Ukraine. It was never clear how they're going to do that, or if they could translate military force into those political objectives. It's even more difficult to understand how they're going to do it now, because at this phase, it's very clear Ukrainians are resisting all over the place, right? Military, civilians, all it's quite committed resistance. The destruction that Russia is now inflicting on Ukraine, like both on infrastructure, on airports, bridges. I think some bridges are being blown up by the Ukrainians themselves, but heavy industry is being destroyed in Kharkiv. Ukraine is going to need a lot of reconstruction funds at the end of this war. Whenever that happens, they're going to need a tremendous amount, or else most Ukrainian economy is not going to be able to recover. And it's not clear that Russia is going to be able to afford that, right? So even if they succeed in taking these cities and installing someone in government, the Russian economy is already going to be in a terrible state. They're not going to have the funds to rebuild all these kind of tractor plants. And so again, it's a big question of how is this going to be worked out? Because we saw what happened in Iraq. If you have a lot of young men who don't have jobs, right, that is a ripe situation for insurgency. And it appears, even if Russia succeeds in taking these cities, that the conditions are going to be ripe for insurgency for the foreseeable future. So it's really hard to see exactly how this ends up positively for Russia. I guess, as a compromise, they obviously, if taking back the rest of the Donbass, which they recognize the LNR DNR's kind of claim to the rest of the Donbass. They've taken parts of southern Ukraine. Maybe their fallback is to just keep that area. But ultimately, they haven't solved their main issue, which is it's the political orientation of Kyiv. And basically, because Ukrainians have resisted so much, they've made it really difficult. And I think it's clear that Russia wanted to conduct a quick and fast military operation to try and achieve its goals. That's failed. And the longer this goes on, right, the bigger questions become, the greater the costs become, and the greater the risk comes. So anyway, it's not fully clear where we go from here. I think we're looking at the next few weeks that are going to be very important to look at. I think 2-3 weeks from now, if this war is still being fought, I think it's going to be very likely that we're going to start seeing a stronger domestic response in Russia, and it really will become hard to predict exactly what will happen at that point.
There's been some speculation, or at least commentary, I think by Mike Kaufman, that the Russians aren't actually fighting like Russians, i.e., that they're not fighting in I guess, battalion tactical groups, the groupings in which we expected, and at least doctrinally they're supposed to fight. I use "supposed to" in air quotes. Is that what you're seeing? In this? And then if I can challenge you, I think a lot of the commentary, particularly in the U.S., but I would assume also in Europe, is to focus on the tactical blunders. It makes things, reassuring, right? At least when we look ourselves in the mirror, that we can tell ourselves that we're quote unquote better. But what are they doing right? In your mind as you watch this, and what do you make of sort of the commentary that they're not fighting like Russians, and that we can't actually draw that many lessons from this, perhaps beyond just the logistical stuff that we've been talking about?
Sure. So look, this is something I've talked with Mike about before, is that the question is, if this becomes a Russian-NATO fight, right, or if there's a Russian-NATO fight in the future, how much are we learning about the Russian military from this, about how they would fight NATO, right? And I think my I think is that we're not learning as much as some people think. I think there are two things. I think there are certainly military mistakes being made, right? They're being made at the tactical level, operational, strategic level. And that's very clear. Some of that is military capability, some of the equipment, right? So as an example, Russia tried to knock out a lot of these airfields, and we have satellite photos of one of these airfields. They fired 6 or 7 missiles at it, and clearly they're trying to hit the runway, and they missed the runway because their PGMs are not accurate enough to reliably hit a runway, which is not that small, right? And we talk about American PGMs, right? I mean, we can put cruise missiles through windows, and it's very clear that Russia cannot do that. And so that is a clear limitation right there, that they don't have accurate enough weapons to be sure of knocking out an airfield with that kind of precision. I think one of the big things to keep in mind, there's been a lot of what Russia's done in this war has been perplexing, and I mean, a lot of what they did in the buildup too was quite perplexing. And there's a video that I remember was on TikTok. This is like a week before the conflict began, and it was showing Russian tanks being offloaded in Belgorod, stuff that was coming from Pogonova, right, the big assembly area, being moved to these kind of tactical staging points to the border. And I remember watching it, and the train station is right near a road, and the Russian soldiers did not block the road off, and there were these civilians were walking up and taking photos of the tanks and stuff like that. And it's really strange to me, right? It was very bizarre, because if Russia was getting ready for war, you would think that they would enforce some kind of operational security to not let people walk right up to tanks and take photos of them. And so at the time I wasn't sure. I think there are a couple of explanations. What's clear to me now is that Russia's political leadership did not tell many people that they were preparing for this war, right? They were planning to invade Ukraine. It clearly came as a shock to many government officials, and to many people in the military, right? And so the explanation, that I have for that video of why they weren't taking those kind of steps is because those soldiers did not know they were going to war, and so they were not acting as though they were preparing for war. And that's why they weren't enforcing operational security that way. So, because of that, but because it's clear that a lot of people were not aware a war was coming, and that includes officers, right? And there are anecdotes of guys who were sent to Belarus, right, had return tickets, right? So it was clear they had a return ticket. They're going to leave once the exile is over. Obviously, that was never planned. They're not going to leave. So anyway, they took these precautions to not allow people to know the war was going on. And it's clear that there are coordination problems and mistakes that are being made. They're evident in this war. and I think the best explanation is that they simply weren't informed about this, right? A lot of, I think, officers as well did not know this was going to happen. So all the staff people, right, the intel, operations, logistics, all those guys that have to heavily coordinate, at different levels, a kind of campaign before they fight. I don't think they did that coordination because I don't think they knew this war was coming. And so that's why we're seeing a lot of coordination issues. That's why we're seeing some logistics issues. It's not clear to me exactly how command and control has worked with all these units, right? They have armies there. I think presumably there are army command and control functions being applied, but there obviously been like some breakdowns in logistics and some other issues. So on one hand, I think that at the political level, Putin set the military up for failure because it's very clear that he didn't let enough people know. They didn't spend time preparing. A lot of junior soldiers who are being taken POWs are saying we found out a day or two prior to war. We were going to war, so they didn't have to prepare for it. Morale was cruelly low, and a lot of the preparation was not clearly being done. And so all those things, right? The military is not set for success. It's clear too that a lot of soldiers who are invading, they don't know the purpose of the war is. They have a task, but they don't understand the purpose, and they don't understand how to deal with civilians. They didn't expect to deal with this kind of with this kind of popular resistance. All that kind of stuff is really confusing, and if you don't prepare for it, it's really difficult. So on one hand, we're talking about what can we learn about how Russia would fight. Because the political leadership set the military for failure, I think a lot of things we can't learn everything from this conflict. And so I think that's on one hand what's happening. On the other hand, right, and I also think that because at the beginning they had a overly optimistic view of what the resistance was going to be, I think they specifically limited the amount of strikes they did right away. I think they wanted to not inflict too many casualties on the Ukrainian military because I don't think they thought that would be bad for the long-term political solution. So that's another indication, right, that a political decision was made that limited the military's effectiveness at running this campaign. So all those things are important to keep in mind. When we look at the military, right, even after those first 2 days, right, once Plan A kind of failed, the military should have been able to knock out Ukraine's Air Force. They still haven't, right? They should have been able to knock out Ukraine's air defenses. They still haven't. Ukraine clearly still has a lot of capabilities they're still working with. It appears they still have Tochka-U tactical ballistic missiles being used. They've launched them at 2 different airfields in Russia. So there are key capabilities Russia's failed to eliminate. And part of that too, right? Ukraine should have been the priority for the GRU, right? It is a traditional military intelligence mission. Find key targets in Ukraine, find Ukraine's key military capabilities, the things that need to be destroyed, and make sure we know where those are. So right when a war kicks off, we can target them, right? Well, clearly they don't know where all these Tochka-Us are. Clearly they don't know where a lot of these systems are, and the targeting is not working that well, right? So there's some clear breakdowns there. Again, the fact that the Ukrainian military is not significantly integrated shows a significant failure. One of the things that's been alleged too is, I thought Russia was going to use a lot of electronic warfare. I thought cyber was going to be really capable. I thought that Ukraine would struggle to communicate, would struggle with command and control. One of the things alleged is that basically, yes, Russia has maybe capable electronic warfare systems, but their radios are not very good. And we've been seeing a lot of soldiers who've been captured that it appears they're relying on non-encrypted radios, right? Black gear, and that means if you use electronic warfare, that can interfere with those radios. So it appears in some cases they're not using their EW capabilities because their radios would not work, or maybe their GPS wouldn't work, right? And it interfere with that too. So that's another limitation. That's mostly an equipment limitation. And look, we're seeing at a tactical level. I think part of the problem too is that the military that invaded is not ideally situated for this war, right? Some of this war is a conventional fight, and so in a conventional fight, having tank battalions is useful, right? Having mechanized infantry is useful, but they have so many tank units, they have so much heavy armor, right? They have too much of that for the actual kind of scenario they're facing, right? Because tanks and heavy armor require much more logistics, more fuel, they break down more spare parts, all that, right? They require a much larger log train. They're still useful. They're useful for targeting Ukrainian tanks, but much of what the situation they're facing is kind of like light infantry or like mobile groups of Ukrainian insurgents at this point. Well, tanks aren't very useful for that, right? And the same thing with a lot of the air defenses, not really that useful. And so we're seeing a lot of this equipment getting stranded on roads, being left. They can't maintain it. They can't fuel it. They can't use spare parts, and they're losing a lot of key heavy equipment And it's clear that it wasn't really well designed for this kind of occupation that they're trying to do. At the same time, the Russian military, so a normal Russian battalion is much more than a NATO battalion. And the Russian military focuses on fires capabilities, other kind of supporting capabilities much more than maneuver units, right? So that in a conventional war, that's very useful, right? Having more fires is useful. There's a debate about whether or not NATO militaries are well structured for a conventional fight. But for an occupation, that's not ideal, right? You want more infantry units, you want more maneuver units to artillery and to other kind of supporting capabilities than vice versa. And so Russia's brought, they brought EW systems, they brought, artillery, all those kind of heavy systems into Ukraine. In a lot of cases, those are not going to be the best guys for patrolling a city, for doing a lot of this kind of, like counterinsurgency type environment work. And it's a big question about how effective it'll be. Of course, Ukraine is a huge country. It is a large population, and it's always been a debate about if they bring in 100, 150,000 troops, is that enough to occupy this entire country? It's not clear it is. I think they're probably going to struggle to do so, right? And when we saw kind of this kind of similar situation with the U.S. and Iraq, and so I think that's going to be a problem as well. So when we talk about what we learn and we can't learn, there's certain decisions made at the political level that have hampered the Russian military's ability to fight this war. However, we're also seeing a lot of mistakes that are military mistakes, but execution, right? Even elite forces, the VDV right now is taking pretty significant casualties. We're seeing that up in northwest outside Kyiv from Ukrainian forces. Spetsnaz units, right? The first guys went to Kharkiv, not clear what they were doing, but they're making some kind of basic mistakes in urban fighting, and it was kind of a bit bizarre. Equipment failures, we've seen a variety of equipment that are not working that great. They're not doing their jobs. Again, one of them is air defense systems, right? Russia's supposed to have the most capable ground-based air defense system, integrated air defense system in the world. They have, both S-400 long-range kind of systems as part of the Russian Air Defense Forces, and then the ground forces, their air defense units are supposed to be very capable too. Well, we saw TB2 strike a Buk M12 system, at least one TLAR and I think one translator, and clearly they're not able to completely negate the Ukrainian Air Force's ability to operate. And so that is, that is a surprise. Not to mention Ukraine operates pretty old aircraft. These are not new aircraft. They're old Soviet aircraft, and the Russian military is struggling to prevent them from operating. So it's still a bit surprising. And those are some key capabilities. They should be able to they should be doing a better job, right? And we've told this before, but Russian military has a lot of experience with TB2s, right? They have a lot of direct and indirect experience in Idlib, in Libya, in Nagorno-Karabakh. And Russian air defense systems have shot down a lot of TB2s there, right? Mostly operated by Syrians, Emiratis, Libyans, or Armenians. But Russian air defense systems have proven they can shoot down TB2s, and a lot of these were kind of older Russian systems, like older versions of the Pantsir S, older versions of like the Buk, so on. So the fact that they're still struggling to handle TB2s is quite surprising because they have better air defense capabilities they're using, operated by Russian troops, and that's supposed to make a bigger difference. And so I've been surprised about that. So anyway, it's clear they're having some issues. It's clear that the Russian Air Force is struggling to do a suppression or destruction of enemy air defense systems mission. Their offensive counter air is not fully working either. So there are some key capability gaps here we're seeing in the Russian military, and it's a problem. And another one is, it's a more general statement, but one of the things we knew before the conflict was that compared to the Russian military, a big strength of the U.S. military is that the U.S. has very good NCOs, as junior leaders that are better, small unit leadership is better, all those kind of things are better, and also the talent of the U.S. military is better, I think, in average. What we're seeing on the Russian side is some very basic leadership mistakes, right? So junior soldiers are not being fed properly, they're not getting enough water, they are not being told what's going on, so they're not informed of what's happening. There are cases where the officers are kind of leaving enlisted soldiers to have, under bad conditions, and the officers are clearly not living under the same kind of conditions. So there's a lot of basic leadership failures that are happening at the low level. And, there are a lot of issues in the Russian military 10 or 15 years ago with hazing. Those issues are still there. They're probably less than they are, than 50 years ago. But the Russian military has basically tried to classify a lot of those things to not provide data on number of Russian deaths every year and the number of suicides, so on. But it's clearly still an issue. Morale is clearly still an issue. The Russian military struggled to increase the number of contract soldiers enough as much as they wanted to. And absolutely after this war, there's going to be an open question about how many, how desirable is enlisting the Russian military as a contract soldier. Will Russians want to do that if they're going to be forced into wars, forced to sign contracts they didn't want to sign, and basically, kind of voluntold to do things they don't want to do. So I think there are going to be a lot of significant issues later on about this, about the morale, small unit leadership, whether or not they're developing an effective NCO corps, the quality of junior leaders and officers. So anyway, there are a lot of things that we're learning with the Russian military. The Russian military is not doing very well. And a number of them I'm surprised about. I thought they'd do better taking care of the Ukrainian Air Force. I thought they'd do a better job of knocking out air defense systems. I thought TB2s did not play a role. All those things have not happened. And to me, it's surprising because Russia has the capability to do so, but they're not basically achieving that. So it will be really significant to look out for. And I suspect once this is over that we're going to see some really significant changes in the Russia's military leadership, right? So, Surovikin, the head of the Russian Aerospace Forces, he might get fired. Garasov might leave. We could see some significant departures because the Russian military is not performing as well as it should be.
I mean, I'll just add one thing and then we'll wrap up here is, it's two sides of the same coin. Russian air defenses in the hands of Ukrainians operating them smartly and efficiently have proved, a deterrent, or at least somewhat of a deterrent to Russian overflight. And if you have no Russian overflight, some of the things that we're talking about, like offensive counter air sweeps, aren't happening, which, allows the Ukrainian Air Force to continue to fly. And I think, as it applies to the TB2s, my always assumption about that is that they would be picked off by the Russian Air Force, not necessarily by ground-based air defenses. They would work in tandem. And when you have one without the other, or you eliminate a huge big piece of the puzzle. So I just continue to scratch my head at perhaps Russian self-restraint on the air power side. Perhaps that's American mirroring and allowing at least these vestiges of the Ukrainian Air Force to continue to fly and attack their supply lines. In some respects, this could be an endorsement for Russian air defense systems, albeit ones, similar to how they were operated in Kosovo in 1999, that they can make life hell even for a large air force. But I think with time will tell. As the listeners may hear, my daughter has just woken up, which is always usually the signal for this podcast to begin to wrap up. So, Rob, I think it's been 7 days. I think we'll probably check back in with you in another 7 days to see how the conflict is going. Anything you'd like to add before we wrap up here?
As I was saying before, the Russian casualty rate, right, is already, orders of magnitude higher than what they sustained in Georgia over 5 days. One thing that's surprising to me, and I mentioned obviously a lot of the mistakes they're making, is that they're making a lot of mistakes they made in 2008, right? And that was a catalyst moment where basically they won that war, they won ugly. They won against a much weaker country, right? They had far smaller defense spending, far smaller country. And in some cases, Georgia had better UAVs than Russia had, right? And so they're very significant equipment kind of problems. And the Russian military began its large, significant reform under then Minister of Defense Anatoly Sergeyevich, and they started a really large state armors program, 2020, they really well funded for the first time since the Soviet era. And they made a lot of developments. The Russian military moved forward a lot. And yet here we are 13 years later, 14 years later, and the Russian military is making a lot of the same mistakes, right? And so, one of the things that, we told before, there are cases where Russian military kind of is driving to cities, right, without, sitting in advance guard, without taking precautions, right, without preparing, what if the city's hostile, should we drive into it? Those kind of mistakes. Right? They did that in Georgia, too. They did that in Georgia. In Georgia, they failed to knock out the Georgian air defense, or Georgian air defenses. They failed to knock out the Georgian airfield. There are intelligence gaps, right? They're hitting the wrong airfields that weren't used. So we're seeing a lot of the same failures, and it's surprising because the Russian military is more capable, right? And they've shown, in Syria, and obviously Syria's a different situation, but they've shown capabilities that they're not necessarily using that effectively right now, and it's quite surprising. And one of them is UAVs, where we haven't seen Russia use UAVs that heavily so far. And some UAVs you can hear them, and we haven't seen that. It's again quite surprising to me. I thought we'd see more of that. I thought we'd see more loitering munitions, a few other things. So it really is shocking to me how much the performance resembles in some ways 2008, because I thought they would do much better. And at the end of this, there's going to be a really significant lesson learned program for the Russian military after this, and they're going to have to go back and they have to make some really dramatic kind of changes because clearly the reforms they made 12 years ago, well, those ended. And then, they've set up some patterns or processes that are not leading to the most adaptive military they should be. And I think they have been slow to adapt. Or they have adapted during this 5-7 days, but they haven't adapted fast enough, right? And again, we're saying Ukrainian military, the Air Force is still bombing that Russian convoy, right, which is well strewn out and not maintained in a tactical fashion. And it's just, again, it is still surprising seeing those kind of mistakes. So it'd be interesting to see what we should go forward. The Russian military is still very capable, right? So by no means should we be underestimating them. And any kind of Russia-U.S. fight, even if it just stayed conventional, would be very painful and bloody for the U.S. military because they have certain capabilities, and I would never say they're not effective, but they are showing they have a lot of weaknesses, and they have more weaknesses than I thought they had, and they did not ameliorate a lot of those vulnerabilities they demonstrated 12 years ago, and that part is quite surprising to me. So. We'll wait a few days. We'll see what happens a week from now. But yeah, I have been surprised at some of the mistakes they're making, which I didn't think they would make.
Rob, as always, it's good to have you on the show, and thanks for following the conflict like you do, and thanks for joining me. And we'll probably see you in a week.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Be sure to subscribe to Chain Reaction on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts to be notified about new episodes. To explore more from the Foreign Policy Research Institute's research, podcasts, and upcoming events, please visit us on www.fpri.org.